I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Dustbowl Diatribes is a Maurin Academy podcast. So, do you guys get the, oh, geez, she's just destroying everything. You guys get the sweet potatoes all in?
Yep, they're being watered in now.
Yay! That's great. All right.
Yep.
They're beautiful. You know? Yeah, after a while they'll just blow up the 2 rows.
Yep.
So, cool.
So thanks for getting those.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, actually I got them at half price because, you know, it was toward the end of the growing season, and so it wasn't that bad. I was surprised they had that many, but I got like 2/3 of what they had left. So, yeah. It'll turn into a lot of food, way more than what it costs to buy the slips.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, our worker scholar seems to be pretty excited about that, which is really good to see.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so I sort of reviewed, you know, all the stuff we've done for this year so far.
Mm-hmm.
And not, you know, I didn't listen to everything again. That would have taken me all day, but I just sort of looked at it and tried to get an idea of, you know, how to like congeal all this. And I know we need to talk about where we're headed next, but yeah. So maybe I'll just kind of summarize first. Like we've talked to several really interesting, you know, fairly heavy-hitting people, I would say. Benjamin Studebaker, I believe, was our first interviewee in January, and then Dave McCarricker of Theory Underground. Well, both of them are associated with Theory Underground. And then John Rao, who talked about the 3 great Catholic revivals. And then we had a little, you know, reprieve from, you know, like lengthy conversations with Tally joining us. And then we had most lately Jody Dean and Spencer Leonard. And both of them in their own way talked about neo-feudalism as a concept and just economic reality and political reality as they saw it. And, you know, so like the through thread to me kind of felt like people struggling with existing reality, people struggling with things the way they are now, and trying to explain why they are the way they are now, and whether we can do anything about it or not. I mean, so that's my initial impression. How do you feel about the season so far?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all that, with the one proviso that like Rao is coming from a radically different perspective than either of the other guests, and that obviously on the other side of Rao, like Jody Dean and Spencer Leonard are coming from a more dogmatically bourgeois and Marxian or Marxist perspective, which obviously makes them different than Studebaker and McCarricker, who are coming from more, well, it's a little unclear where especially McCarricker is at or where he will be going in the future politically, presumably in a pretty right-wing direction.
Maybe, yeah. Maybe we
Maybe.
can talk about them first, because a little bit of good news maybe is that Dave has agreed to give a talk for the Maurin Academy as part of our speaker series in August. I think it's August 12th, but I put that on the calendar. So whatever the Maurin Academy calendar says. And he wants to talk about several concepts, but among them is just kind of like where he's been and where he's going. And let me see if I can find that. Well, I probably can't find it in time, but like he even mentioned talking about natality or kind of like attachment to the land and things like that. So I think it'll be a good talk. And I don't know, like if we were to just isolate McCarricker and Studebaker, both from Theory Underground, or at least Studebaker's associated with them, I guess I would say both of them are in their own way, fairly conservative. Is that your impression, or how would you kind of like characterize those two?
I mean, I read Studebaker as some sort of like social democrat that's been quote unquote black pilled about a number of things. But that at the end of the day, like he would still like something like a Bernie Sanders as a potential solution at the national and international level to the assorted crisis that afflict us.
Okay.
Crises. And
Mhm.
so I guess you can call that at this late date, that is, I guess, a species of conservatism in the like modern sense.
Right. Well, I guess when I characterized him as conservative, I was thinking of the message that we couldn't do anything right now, that we were stuck in this deep pluralism and that there were all these restrictions, and that ultimately the time was not right for any sort of fundamental change. I would agree with you that he would prefer to have like some sort of, Bernie Sanders or even more left, socialism. But he seemed to be so convinced that, nothing really could be done right now because of the dynamics of our situation, with just so many, so not only so many different interests and interest groups and identities and positions, but also because most people are in our society are motivated more by what they stand to lose than what they stand to gain. And that's conservative, whether he knows it or not, to say we are thinking more about what we might lose rather than what we stand to gain is very, very conservative. Now, he's saying that most Americans are in that mind frame. Whether he is or not personally is another matter, but as far as what he's describing and the dynamics, it sounds really conservative to me. And then McCarricker is, you're right, I think, leaning conservative, partly as a reaction to maybe the failure of the left to enact real change in America, and partly because of his own family legacy towards, farming and the land. What's your sense of him?
Yeah, and I would add he seems to be pretty intellectually precocious. And if part of what you're interested in is always questioning received dogmas from the left in general, because he can say he's like he was on a panel with Douglas Lane and a few other people for Platypus's convention. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like he can say he's not on the left or whatever, but then it's like scroll through Theory Underground. And like, yes, maybe there's token right wingers they're talking to, but like there's a reason he's post left and not post right or right or whatever designation he might accept at this juncture.
Yeah.
But and then probably also the postmodernism helps him get there to whatever extent it like deconstructs leftism for him. But I would say as soon as you start to ask basic questions about nature and the given nature of reality, you are already on a right-wing track. Like
Yes.
you're already tipping in that direction as soon as you start asking those questions, because to be on, especially the hard left, anarchist, socialist, whatever, is predicated, at least generally, people can do some work to synthesize it. Obviously, there's like anarcho-primitivists or whatever. But once you start asking what is real, what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, you've left this kind of Faustian, Marxist, Nietzschean space where all of that doesn't matter because the only thing that's true is the will to power, or the forward march of history or whatever.
Yeah. He has not been or has not yet been exposed to arguments from the right, of the proper right. I mean, obviously everybody's been exposed to the whatever counts as right in the United States. But the reason why I say that is because, in our conversation with him, there was this tendency to be curious about and even respect things like homeschooling, and just kind of recognizing the need for private people to try to cocoon themselves against you know, the larger world, or especially the predations of capitalism, which is not a which is a conservative thought, actually, when it comes right down to it. So I wonder if McCarricker might identify, if he was fully exposed to it, might identify with a older type of conservatism. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to his talk to see if he, like where his thinking is now as he settles in on his family's farm.
And as part of it, at the risk of doing too much insider baseball, is he going to relate it at all to Maurin's thought?
Yeah. I mean, we recommended that. We recommended he read that. He and Anne said that they were going to read a little bit of Maurin and study up on Catholic Worker. I don't know.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That last conversation that I had with both of them on their stream was interesting, because I think Anne was interested in really, like solid apologetics or solid defenses of Christianity, as opposed to what she had been exposed to. And Dave had just never been exposed to very much of that, but he was admirably not closed to any of it. And in fact, Theory Underground has been fairly open-mindedly trying to study and understand religious people, among other things. So I got to give him credit for not being like in that, sort of like hewing to one lane. I think that's really good. There's a reason why the two organizations ended up meeting up through one of our patrons.
Yeah, and at the risk of jumping further ahead, I think that is a way better way to proceed than like what Spencer said. We'll have basically escaped the need for, pre-modern dogmatic religious systems. And to me, where that's ultimately unsatisfying is like it turns into basically like denying the dangerous core of really any religious tradition. It seems to me. And another way to put it is like it basically does violence to it. If violence is like forcing to do something against its nature, if like all of the dogmatic claims of religion are not to be taken seriously, because at the end of the day, liberalism is our true religion and belief system. Or whatever perfected bourgeois communist society realizes the values of liberalism. Yeah, it requires doing, I think, either if it doesn't inherently require doing violence to all the pre-modern religious convictions, at the very least, it risks liquidating them of all of their substance that doesn't go along with the kind of de facto nihilism of bourgeois society.
Yeah.
Or at least that's how it seems to me.
Yeah, I'm fairly in agreement with you. I feel like he had a fairly self-conscious view of what he was doing. So it wasn't subconscious. Basically, he straight up argued that, Christianity had been more or less subsumed, in his view, under liberalism, and then liberal development was going to eventually lead to socialism. And all of this was kind of like at least partly secularized Christianity, so that the value of Christianity or religion more generally would be these, sort of like basic impulses that get sucked up into the political and economic level. And obviously, there's a problem with that, because people's real lived experience is that these are more than that. And in fact, I would go so far as to say this is, as much as I liked Leonard, it's part of people, especially, we might say, since socialists are interested in the working class and in more or less bringing their needs and their priorities to the fore, they are more likely to actually believe in God and in something transcendent that doesn't get subsumed in nothing more than our economics or our political position. And so I think McCarracker's strategy of actually digging and listening and being open to the actual message that religious people are offering is more respectful to the many millions of people who actually believe that, many of whom are working class people. I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like a lot of times, like, leftists want to champion the common people, but they won't like seed on this one really basic area where most common people do actually have a sense of God and God's existence. And this really is a block for people on the left. So McCarracker kind of is trying to at least overcome that block, whereas maybe Leonard is more representative of people who just don't see the point.
Right. And just to make sure that we're framing the square, and you and I, at least, I think in the past we've disagreed with this. I tend to think at the end of studying all this, that it's not an accident that the majority of conservatives, modern conservatives and pre-modern conservatives, it's not a mistake that the majority of conservatives, quote unquote, regard any kind of leftism as essentially, intrinsically, inherently atheistic. And in part, that's because the majority of leftists also, at the end of the day, regard their leftism as intrinsically atheistic.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah. Right. It's not that those two things necessarily are incompatible, but that most leftists in the modern world have stated their incompatibility and just do not relate. And that is not essential. At least in my view, it's not essential. Now, in other words, to be a leftist should not mean that you have to embrace atheism. Although the sort of like the kernel of truth there is that if you're a leftist and you think that the only real thing that you can improve and that is worth putting your time into is nothing but material equality, then yeah, then there is kind of like a exclusion point there. But that isn't
Well,
necessary.
and I would add, and the practical reason it has been necessary is because part of what the bourgeois revolution's been doing since wherever you want to date it, I would submit like Henry VIII, the start of Anglicanism, wherever you want to like source it, there is an inherent, I think, breaking with a pre-modern unity of religious traditions and traditional communitarian social orders.
Mm-hmm.
Is where I don't think it's just arbitrary that we could just have a theistic socialism in any sort of straightforward way. In theory, I guess we can. In practice and in history, I'm not convinced that you actually can do that. Is where
In
I'm.
practice and history, yeah, right, right. You would have to kind of remake the argument, right? And refer to early Christianity and to the gospel teachings and maybe propose that sharing our resources is what is mandated. And then how do we share our resources? Well, there's a lot of different ways that we could conceive of doing that, but you'd have to go back to kind of that original plane, right? And short of
And
that, yeah.
it's not a mistake that actually I take it back. I wouldn't cite Henry VIII and Anglicanism. I would cite like the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say it's a whole chain. But that was also the Renaissance dream, or a substantial part of those thinkers was, what if we can start over? What if we
Right.
can get back to the sources and imagine how we've been radically off the whole time and how we could be radically centered? And it's not a mistake that, go down the literature of various kind of utopian thinkers and starting in that era. And you can find it in saints in the Catholic Church, and you can find it in alchemical occultists. It was a widespread dream of how do we transform lead into gold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the modern turn was away from, was away from God's authority or, this sort of, I don't know, unifocal source of authority.
Instantiated in an actually existing social order, however imperfectly.
Mm-hmm. And so no matter what type of thinking that you see, once you move past that Renaissance period, or once you get into it, you see both in religious and in secular matters a tendency for human beings to think that they can manipulate the situation single-handedly, right? So in Christianity, that was, the turn towards eventually Protestantism and the idea of social engineering that came with it, where, we can make everybody, orderly and morally good and such by our laws and our social engineering. And in the economy, it becomes, the idea that we can structure the economy or let loose the dynamics of the economy as time move forward, to, kind of unshackle our human potential Same thing in politics. But in all three cases, religion, economics, and politics, the idea was humans have like the key to unlocking this potential that's kind of buried or inherent in our nature. And what makes that different from earlier times is I think there was more of a sense that we as humans cannot completely do that on our own. It takes, God and God's authority to do that.
And just to be clear, where this is very murky in all sorts of ways, whether we're talking about Renaissance humanists that were still Catholic, either earnestly or superficially, or we're talking about early Protestants or Protestants of the quote unquote radical Reformation, like Anabaptists. Very few of these people were explicitly saying, actually, we want a secular society and actually we will do it on our own merits. They were not yet in this kind of like post-Hegelian framework. The bourgeois revolution was in the early stages of happening, not completed. And so I just want to clarify, it's not like the average Anglican bishop thought probably that they were part of a secular revolution.
No, yeah, and I don't think at all. Yeah, I'm sort of following Charles Taylor's argument on this, that, the origin of this, at least in the religious sphere, was actually a desire to be closer to God, right? Or to become more purely Christian or pure in one's Christianity and so on. But the impulse at this point was to engineer that purity, and they didn't quite grasp like the ultimate consequences of that turn, like we always don't, basically. But that notion that we can that starts with the scientific revolution, or even a little earlier, that we can more or less reason and engineer our way into what we want, including holiness, is, ultimately leads to people sensing what they feel is their own power, right? To make things happen if they simply think them through and structure and organize them correctly. Even in, some of the early mendicant orders, according to Taylor, there was this tendency.
Sure. And this is the core of the Orthodox critiques of Catholicism, is that already those mendicant orders are a deviation from the solid Christian Benedictine tradition. And already you're having these rootless, cosmopolitan, proto-bourgeois spiritualities that will give birth to bigger problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, it's tragic in its unfolding. So maybe that leads us to like Rao and what he offered us in the way of insights about all of this. Because like you said, he was coming from a fairly different angle, really different perspective entirely. But would he not say, because I did go back and listen to parts of that again, because that one was the one that it was hard for me to find the through thread on it. But would he not say that the ebbs and flows of more or less like God's influence in the world through the church happens because of more or less God's will? As in, because I remember he mentioned at a certain point, like the church was going into another, was in one of these valleys where politics had more or less, like local families, power and such had taken over and was steering it. But then he mentioned St. Catherine of Genova, I think, or Genoa.
I think Genoa.
Genoa, okay. as a person who was part of kind of like reviving a sense of holiness and getting the church back on track, which would mean God's at work in there, right? Like,
Well,
how did you read it?
I mean, I think both. I think you can, the Catholic and the Orthodox position is that everything is both always in part humans' will and always in part God's will. And it's maybe not 100% of both those things, but it is a paradoxical intermingling of those things. And so God, using Catherine of Genoa as an example, God in extraordinary ways lavished grace upon her. And she was nested in a social order where to various degrees grace was being poured out. But nevertheless, she in a particular way was receptive to that. And had she not been, it wouldn't have worked out the way it did. And arguably, because, I mean, at the risk of sounding impious, to whatever extent she was sinful, perhaps she limited God's grace in her life and all sorts of things that she did or didn't do. It could be argued. And that's the case of everyone except Christ and Mary, I guess, is the right pious answer.
Right.
So synergy is the term for all this. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, just to say that it sounds like ultimately God's will or God's intention prevailed more in this situation. So
or did their holiness is the mystery.
yeah.
What if God's will is for us all to be more holy than Saint Catherine?
Mm-hmm.
And yet in all sorts of ways we frustrate it.
Yeah, that's one of those big theological questions about, what is our responsibility and what is God's?
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know how to answer that because I really don't know. But sort of like the classic answer seems to be that God is, all powerful and omniscient and so on. And therefore, ultimately, his plan wins. But on the other hand, God created human beings, and obviously human beings have had this huge impact, right? Much of which has been negative on themselves and on the planet, which would seem to suggest that God has ceded some territory as far as, allowing us our impact and our free will. So your description of kind of both holding power at the same time is actually, I think, maybe pretty accurate.
Right. And partly, I think there's something profound to when we had Eugene Macabre give that talk, and he made the argument that it's a mistake to do what most Protestant historians do and try and find God's will in history, because that is a pretty murky thing to figure out. But it is a lot easier to figure out what have been humans' motivations throughout history. That's clearer. And then you're not denying providence in all sorts of ways, but you're putting the emphasis on a more natural level where using natural methods, you can more closely figure out what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a very true thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that is not to deny, as I said, providence. But again, I think I said this in the Grange about the Rao interview, but to me, the most interesting thing about how the kind of dissonance between those first two revivals he talked about and the second one, the sort of, to use my words, he didn't quite call it this, but a kind of late Baroque Vatican I informed Catholic Renaissance. It's usually called the 19th century Catholic Revival. That, to me, the dissonance of that is then, from a traditionalist perspective, how do you square that with the massive debacle from a traditionalist perspective that has been the post-Vatican II church? is that how could this great revival have issued into this? And
Right. Right. Although, I mean, he described these periods of time in previous church history where same sort of thing happened. It just, well, maybe not exactly, right? Because there's this council which issues all these edicts, and then, you know, here's what happens. But, he's describing this ebb and flow where worldliness kind of takes over. And in the case of Vatican II, the worldliness and, I guess whatever you want to call it, God's power, I think we're doing battle. And from my understanding, and I'm not, an expert in this, but from my understanding, Vatican II's pronouncements weren't bad. It was what people made of them, right? So the church was already had a problem before this came down.
correct, right. The trads like to say it's a weaponized ambiguity. That it's hard to tease out what exactly is wrong, heretical with these texts. Again, I'm not endorsing this view, but there is something to it. Yeah, it's not so much that the texts themselves are inherently flawed, but then how they are subsequently interpreted
Right.
was largely in a worldly manner.
Yes, yes. I think it's fair to say the texts probably weren't very flawed, since they were such a large pronouncement from the church. Although some of it was reacting perhaps too much to what was happening at that very point in time. So there's always a mixture of the human and the divine and things like this, even though this was a council. So, but I think that very quickly people, as they do, ran with it, right? And so you got things that weren't anticipated, practices and beliefs and just behaviors that weren't anticipated by the church, that were kind of hard to rein in. Should have been, maybe, if they'd have had people who were more like politically, weirdly, because I kind of think that the church does have a lot of people who are kind of politically savvy, but apparently they did not anticipate this explosion of creativity. And yeah, I wasn't paying attention at that point, so this is all like stuff that I've heard just like you, but it certainly sounds like people ran with it.
Yeah, for sure. Right, and we are still, part of me converting to Catholicism was accepting that, like, I'm moving into the church in kind of the wake of this crisis. And to me, it's kind of annoying because what it looks like is a lot of the same discussions happening over and over again. And the dualism most people are navigating, if it's not liberal versus conservative, it's traditionalist versus modernist.
Mm-hmm.
And endless discussions are had about how exactly the liturgy should be treated, as if the laity is really in any position to do much about it. But the interesting core of Rau's treatment of that third Catholic revival was basically an admission that even before Vatican II, what that Vatican I revival was championing was what would later be called the universal call to holiness, and an increased activity in the laity in the direction of Catholic action.
Yeah. Which we need another revival of that. I feel like there was this period of time where this was on the upswing, the idea of the laity and their activism, or their, fervent kind of support for Catholic teachings, in particular social teachings. And now, at least in America, and I think, there's not a whole lot of evidence that it's, different in other parts of the world. We seem to be at a nadir of that at this point in time, with almost like quiescence, just, they're gonna go to church. Nobody's going to say anything. They're gonna go home. Nothing's gonna happen substantially, and yeah. So
Yeah, which is somewhat true, and yet that's true, but so is the opposite, that there is probably among right-leaning Catholics, probably since World War II, an unprecedented level of dissatisfaction with capitalism, the nation state, liberalism, etc., that is coinciding with whether you want to call it post-neoliberalism, like the platypus people do, or neo-feudalism, like Jody Dean do, or techno-feudalism, as less interesting people than either of those do. There is this overlap. There is this hope that perhaps we are on the cusp of some sort of, I don't know how many of them would be bold enough to say this, but basically some sort of new Middle Ages where perhaps a lot of these pre-World War II questions are going to come back.
right.
And that can coexist with a still very lethargic laity.
Well,
I think both of those things are true.
you'll be happy to know that Joel Kotkin never got back to me, so he's getting crossed off my list. If you were referring to him,
I was thinking more Varoufakis, but I would include him. I would include Kotkin too.
yeah, I didn't think about asking Varoufakis, but Varoufakis is kind of like he's definitely a political actor, not a political, theorist. He would be like maybe the premier person in the actual political space that follows the neo-feudal thesis. But yeah, like I try to get a hold of Kotkin, who's I guess would fall more into the conservative camp of neo-feudalism. And I didn't get back.
Slash, depending on how you read him, is literally just a neoconservative.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So we can check him off, and that's okay. And as
But
far as
we try and be ecumenical here.
we do, yeah. No, I really, anybody who's written a book on neo-feudalism, I wanted to hear from them, and it would have been interesting to, to hear the difference between the two as well as the similarities, right? But they are completely different orbits, and he probably never got I think I sent him a couple of emails. He's got like a publicity page where you can, request a contact. Never got anything, which is most likely not a personal thing, but rather that nobody's operating it on the other end is kind of what, having kind of like moved in those circles, I would say, because he's not that big of a deal, right? He's probably just never saw it. And these days I only try twice. So bye, Joel Kotkin and Yanis Varoufakis. Well, we haven't tried, but what are the chances? So I think we got a good, maybe this is a good chance to talk a little bit about the interview with Jody Dean's the only person we haven't discussed so far. We were, I think, impressed by the LA Review of Books article on her concept of neo-feudalism that then led to a book, that more recently came out, but it seems to me that her position hadn't changed a whole lot. She was inspired by Mackenzie Wark and the idea that we were in some sort of different economy. And she describes it as neo-feudalism because a lot of the economic competition is out of the equation, and an awful lot of power and just, position comes from who you know. Anyway, like, I thought it was a good interview. It gave the left neo-feudal position. I don't know if it really matters too much whether we're in neo-feudalism or not. I mean, even she said that, we're still in capitalism. It's just taking this neo-feudal expression.
Right. Although she is prophesying that at some point neo-feudalism will affect some sort of collapse of capitalism.
Right. Into something worse, though, right? Not something better.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that we would have to go through this kind of dark ages
Yeah,
situation.
well, she doesn't really spell it out, but yeah, it's hard to imagine it won't be some sort of anarcho feudal capital sort of thing.
Right. Right. So maybe that kind of like gets us back to the beginning of if Dean is right, and maybe more generally, all these neo-feudalism people are right that we are facing a substantially different order economically, politically. This is happening, and we certainly can see, evidence of it kind of happening, even if it's in a misshapen kind of way.
Hmm.
Does that lend credence to your own position of, I don't know, to a certain extent, traditionalism in Catholicism, and just kind of like a refocusing on Christian faith? How do you see like the relationship between what's going on in the world, if you don't mind, and like how you're kind of moving in your own life now?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, when I, kind of imagine my life and my future, is at the end of the day, am I committed to a life of prayer and to a certain extent trying to live within the bounds of nature? And also because I still identify as like a post-Marxist, I'm not fully willing to give up on the idea that, there are radical possibilities for transforming the society we live in for the better. I don't want to fully give that up, but at the end of the day, um, I'm not taking up arms for like the people or the working class or something like that.
Mm,
Especially when these theories are casting all sorts of doubt on, is there even a proletariat anymore? Or even if there is in a in itself way, there's not a proletariat for itself, so who am I even fighting for? You know,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
like I
yeah.
said in the Grange last month, it's not like there was no left. There was a left that dropped the ball on creating a new future. There was no left if the
Hmm.
platypus people are right.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
And Studebaker certainly seems to validate that, right? At least from what we've
r-
heard from him.
right. Now they have a beef with him that I kind of vibe with, that like he's still sneaking through the back door, but actually there's a left. But actually, if we could get our ducks in a row again, we could do things differently. Um, I don't know, but
I
and
mean, in our discussion with him, as well as his talk for the Maurin Academy, I just felt like he left very little room for that, right? Like it was so, we're doomed, at least for the foreseeable future. I mean, the whole point seemed to be we're stuck. We're really, really stuck in
sure,
this, yeah,
yeah,
oscillation.
but there's still the catch is the we. Who is the we? What is the nature of this we? And is there still a we the people thing going on? And if we the people could just become enlightened, perhaps we could organize to do something. And
Right.
part of it, for me, where it's been informed by practice is like I can barely keep a small community farming together. So
Yeah.
my imagination, my patience to imagine a we that's doing anything other than scraping by is very hard to imagine
Mm-hmm.
at this
Yes.
late date.
Sure. Yeah. Somebody else would have to do that, right? Like if it's going to happen, it's going to have to come from some other direction with a lot more resources. And in the absence of that, then I think kind of tending your own garden, so to speak, is uh, not a bad option at all. Um, Maybe since we have like limited time, we should we should talk about where we're going next. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, as I understand it, like what we've discussed kind of off recording is that we're going to we're going to do like a season 4. So, and we will be turning to interviews with people who are in the Catholic worker movement or adjacent to it. And there's a variety of people, right, with a variety of perspectives. So people aren't going to be getting all the same views, but these people will be dealing with the challenges involved in doing kind of what you're doing or what we're doing on the farm and in the Maurin Academy, what kind of challenges exist and how they're dealing with it and how they see the world. Yeah, like what do you kind of hope to get out of it?
I don't know that I have any specific hopes. I'm being pretty via negativa about it all. Because I know what we're gonna largely find is people that are saying what I just said a little while ago. Like, I don't know, dude. I'm just scraping by on some mixture of material success and dogmatic ambitions that are leading me to do things that are against my immediate self-interest. And how this all converges in some sort of better future, I don't really know. I've been around these people long enough to know that that's more or less the best answer you're going to get,
Yeah. Well, this would be something that I
which is
think.
a bad ad for a 4th season.
Oh
But
no. I mean, no, I think the way to square that is that this is a perspective that a lot of our listeners are not familiar with, right? That have not encountered, maybe to a certain extent, if they've been listening for a while, they've heard it through our discussion of like the struggles involved in getting this farm to work. But like for most people, they're not nearly as acquainted with the type of person or group that's really trying to do something kind of that goes against the grain of the world as it is moving right now, and really like honestly discussing the struggles involved, challenges, and also the moments of success and just why they're doing this. Because, as you point out, like when you choose if you choose an alternative path that doesn't uh, align with the society's priorities at the moment, it's not likely to be instantaneously successful. Or if it is, it's usually because you've made like a lot of compromises to kind of make it align with what is successful. And of course, life is full of compromises, but there's this point where you're not, you're not like pursuing what you wanted to begin with. So the people that we will be talking to will be people largely who have tried to resist that temptation and have tried to, live life according to their principles despite this headwind. And I think it'll be instructive to people. We'll learn some things. I think our audience will learn more just because this is not something that they have had a wide window into, right? A lot of them anyway. So, I mean, and I'm always up for, I want to ask, we've talked to Catholic workers before. It's not like we haven't done this to a certain extent, but I want to ask, fundamental questions about why are you doing this? What kind of effect are you expecting? Is it connected up with faith or not? Why? And these kinds of things. I don't know. What would you say is the intention that you would have in mind when doing these interviews?
yeah, I mean, I would say that, and I would say like further clarifying. I guess I look at part of what we're doing as specifically on this podcast, like theory is being sort of compared, specific political theological theories are being compared to other theories. And hopefully some of those theories are either find lacking, like, I mean, I've been on record, maybe not saying as clearly as this, but the Catholic workers that at the end of the day are not Catholic, but are radical liberals. That to me is like an untenable theory for like how to live your life, I think. I mean, if they keep it together, it's better than a lot of other worldviews that people can get ideologically sucked into.
Mhm.
So there's an aspect in which I would like their theories to be clarified for them and for us. And then also, the project that I think we're both interested in, how do we synthesize aspects of Marxian politics, or Marxian economics rather, and anarchist political theory? How do those get synthesized with, my interests in like a hard traditionalist Catholic Christianity?
Mhm.
Is kind of my agenda. But we also have to not do violence to the interviewees' perspectives and earnestly hear them out.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what the secret grange is for, is, after we hear them out, we can have our own discussion of them. And I would add, to that agenda, like comparing their ideas and ours with actual real life, and discussing what is tenable and what is possible, or what is possible now as opposed to what is possible in the future potentially. I mean, that's always kind of on my radar screen, especially with, in the case of Catholic workers, we've talked a little bit about, do you focus on kind of building community and hospitality and maybe growing food, or do you focus more on politics and political protest and things like that? And I think the answer to that question does have something to do with what is actually going on in your times, because there's times when those things actually are really momentous. Activism, for instance, can be momentous, but it's usually when some turn is about to happen anyway. In a lot of other cases, just kind of slowly building or preserving the community that may exist is actually more impactful. It depends. So that's another issue for me, is like, okay, given the times that we are in, and maybe the times that we can see could possibly exist in the near future, are these like viable ideas, right? Or practices? And, like we've talked about how, it's very difficult for your farm to be able to provide food for people who are at this point in time so like addicted to grocery stores, restaurants, and processed foods that they don't even know like what to do with that. Whether they're poor or rich doesn't even matter. So, but at another point in our history, food coming from the ground,
Almost all
like a
other
real,
points in our history.
well, yeah, like food coming from the ground would just be like an unmitigated boon, right? Like, like, yes, this is great, right? Yeah, right. So we're living in odd times that may not last forever. And so, I want to think about, are some of these practices viable for building a near future, or not at all, and so on. So I'm excited to think about
Right.
that.
And then I'd add at the theoretical level, a through thread of, seasons 1 through now 4 is and will be like becoming very conscious of what liberalism is and what bourgeois society is, and how whenever you think you're like escaping that, are you really?
Right.
And that's going to be coming
Yes.
up, probably more so in the Grange than other words, but than in like the actual interviews. But for me, I've just I've increasingly reconciled myself that this is one of the crosses I have to bear in this life, is doing very remedial work to explain what liberalism is and how it's usually when you think you fully escaped it that you are still in the throes of liberalism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It is good work. And by the way, for people who are maybe tuning in for just the first or just one of a few times, the Secret Grange is what we do on the Patreon side. And so every, episode, typically Spencer and I get together and we kind of like post game our interviews. And we put them on our Patreon feed for people at the worker, scholar, or salt of the earth levels. So if you were wondering what that was about, that is what that's about. So, if this is interesting to you, like think about joining at one of those levels so that you can get those thoughts as well. This is a rare case where Spencer and I are talking about, like, we're doing a sort of retrospective of a series of interviews for public consumption. But most of the time when we do retrospectives or like really fully react to our interviewees, we're doing it on the Secret Grange, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And we have a Granger Danger hotline, which nobody uses. So I was like, maybe we should just, I don't know, what should we do with this? Like people were supposed to call us and ask us questions, but we do have a lot of listeners, I feel like, but they're not doing this like through Patreon. So should we keep the Granger Danger hotline?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't see just because something is failing utterly hasn't stopped me from doing most other things in my life. So why cater to the audience now?
All right. Well, I mean, that's a valid response, and there's really no cost other than we have to use it every once in a while or we lose it. But and I can't even remember the number right now. But
Well,
if
it's
you
for
join
patrons
our
only. Yeah.
yeah, if you join our Patreon, we'll post the number. You're right. Not giving that secret sauce out
I think
publicly.
think it actually has to be renewed since nobody's updated it, but maybe this is a good time to do
Oh,
that.
okay. Yeah, maybe we better now that we've talked about it. So, all right. Um, and yeah, when we do that, we'll post it on Patreon in the hopes that we get like a real good question. And then if we do, we will answer that in our Secret Grange episode. So, anyway, well, I'm looking forward to the next season, season 4. And yeah, do we have, we haven't really talked about this, but do we have an interviewee that we want to aim at for July?
I mean, we have some lists, but I haven't emailed anybody. So,
Okay. All right. Well, let's keep in touch about that. Add Clark Massey. I feel like he's interviewed us multiple times,
yeah.
and we should interview him back.
Yeah. Maybe so.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for listening. And yeah, look for our new season starting sometime in July.
Yeah, take care, everybody. Thanks for listening.